Abraham Lincoln was a Kentucky-born frontiersman and a self-taught lawyer who became the great emancipator and preserved the Union. Abraham Lincoln, the 16th United States President, was born in Hardin County, Kentucky on February 12, 1809. He came from humble beginnings, born in a one-room log cabin. Lincoln's physical appearance was striking, standing 6 feet 4 inches tall with a gaunt frame. His family's property holdings were modest at best. He was largely self-educated, having less than a year of formal schooling throughout his entire childhood. Young Lincoln educated himself by reading every book he could find by candlelight. Then in 1816, his family moved to Indiana seeking better farmland and a fresh start in the wilderness. Abraham Lincoln grew up splitting rails and working the frontier farms of the American Midwest. In 1818, when Lincoln was just 9 years old, his mother Nancy Hanks Lincoln died from milk sickness. The loss devastated the young boy. His father Thomas remarried a year later to Sarah Bush Johnston, a widow with 3 children of her own. Sarah encouraged Abraham's love of learning and recognized his intellectual gifts. In 1830, the Lincoln family moved again, this time to Illinois, where the 21-year-old Abraham struck out on his own. Lincoln worked as a rail splitter, a flatboat operator, and a store clerk in New Salem, Illinois. He was a man of the people, rough around the edges but possessed of natural intelligence and wit. Lincoln had an insatiable appetite for knowledge. He studied grammar, mathematics, and literature on his own. He borrowed books from anyone who would lend them. In 1832, Lincoln ran for the Illinois General Assembly. He lost that first election, but the experience gave him a taste for politics. That same year, he served briefly in the Black Hawk War as a militia captain, though he saw no combat. After the war, Lincoln returned to New Salem and became a partner in a general store, but the business failed, leaving him with significant debt that took years to repay. Lincoln called it his national debt, and he worked tirelessly to pay back every penny. In 1834, Lincoln won election to the Illinois state legislature as a member of the Whig Party. He served for successive terms. While serving in the legislature, Lincoln taught himself law by reading legal texts and observing court proceedings. He was admitted to the bar in 1836 and began practicing law in Springfield, Illinois. Lincoln quickly gained a reputation as an effective and honest lawyer. He rode the judicial circuit, traveling from county to county to try cases. His folksy manner and storytelling ability made him popular with juries. Lincoln handled all manner of cases, from property disputes to criminal trials, and he became one of the most respected attorneys in Illinois. In 1842, Abraham Lincoln married Mary Todd, a woman from a prominent Kentucky family. Mary was well-educated, cultured, and ambitious. The marriage was often stormy, marked by Mary's volatile temperament and Lincoln's periods of melancholy. Together they had 4 sons, Robert, Edward, William, and Thomas, though only Robert would survive to adulthood. The deaths of his children, particularly Willie in 1862, would haunt Lincoln throughout his life. In 1846, Lincoln was elected to the United States House of Representatives. He served 1 term in Congress, where he opposed the Mexican-American War, arguing that President Polk had unnecessarily provoked the conflict. His anti-war stance was unpopular with his constituents, and he chose not to seek re-election. After his congressional term ended in 1849, Lincoln returned to Springfield and his law practice. He seemed to have left politics behind, focusing on his legal career and his family. But the issue of slavery would not let him rest. Lincoln had always believed slavery was morally wrong, though he did not initially advocate for immediate abolition. He believed the institution should be contained and allowed to die out gradually. In 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act threatened to expand slavery into new territories. The act outraged Lincoln and drew him back into politics. He began speaking out against the expansion of slavery with a passion and eloquence that captured public attention. In 1858, Lincoln challenged Stephen Douglas for his Senate seat. The 2 men engaged in a series of 7 debates across Illinois that became legendary. The Lincoln-Douglas debates focused primarily on the issue of slavery and its expansion. Douglas advocated for popular sovereignty, allowing each territory to decide the slavery question for itself. Lincoln argued that slavery was morally wrong and should not be allowed to spread. Though Lincoln lost the Senate race, the debates made him a national figure. His arguments against slavery, delivered with logic, moral clarity, and rhetorical power, resonated across the North. Lincoln was not an abolitionist firebrand like William Lloyd Garrison or Frederick Douglass, but rather a moderate who opposed slavery's expansion while respecting the Constitution's protections where slavery already existed. In 1860, the Republican Party nominated Abraham Lincoln for president. The election became a four-way race that split along sectional lines. Lincoln's name did not even appear on the ballot in most southern states. He won the presidency with less than 40% of the popular vote but a clear majority in the Electoral College. Lincoln's election triggered a crisis. Southern states, fearing a Republican administration would threaten slavery, began seceding from the Union. South Carolina left first in December 1860, followed by 6 more states before Lincoln even took office. The seceding states formed the Confederate States of America and elected Jefferson Davis as their president. On March 4, 1861, Abraham Lincoln was sworn in as the 16th President of the United States. In his inaugural address, Lincoln tried to reassure the South that he had no intention of interfering with slavery where it already existed, but he firmly declared that the Union was perpetual and that secession was illegal. He hoped to avoid war, but he would not allow the nation to be torn apart. 1 month later, on April 12, 1861, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. The Civil War had begun. Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. 4 more states joined the Confederacy, bringing the total to 11. The nation was divided, brother against brother, in the bloodiest conflict in American history. Lincoln faced enormous challenges as a wartime president. He had to build an army, find competent generals, maintain support in the North, keep the border states from seceding, and prevent European powers from recognizing the Confederacy. Lincoln had no military training beyond his brief militia service, yet he immersed himself in military strategy and tactics. He read books on warfare and frequently visited his generals in the field. Lincoln struggled to find a commander who could match the tactical brilliance of Confederate General Robert E. Lee. He went through a succession of commanders, including Avin McDowell, George McClellan, Ambrose Burnside, and Joseph Hooker, before finally finding his man in Ulysses S. Grant. The early years of the war went poorly for the Union. Confederate forces won major victories at Bull Run, Fredericksburg, and Chancellorsville. The North had advantages in population, industry, and resources, but the South had better leadership and higher morale. Lincoln faced fierce criticism from all sides. Radical Republicans wanted him to move faster on emancipation. Democrats accused him of tyranny for suspending habeas corpus and imposing martial law. The press attacked him mercilessly, calling him incompetent, a dictator, and worse. Political cartoonists depicted him as an ape or a buffoon. Lincoln endured the criticism with patience and humor, often telling self-deprecating jokes to deflect the attacks. Lincoln understood that the war was ultimately about slavery, even if he could not say so publicly at first. Many Northerners supported the war to preserve the Union but opposed fighting to free the slaves. Lincoln had to move carefully on emancipation, waiting for the right moment. That moment came after the Battle of Antietam in September 1862. Though tactically inconclusive, Antietam was enough of a Union victory for Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. On January 1, 1863, the proclamation went into effect, declaring that all slaves in rebel-held territory were forever free. The Emancipation Proclamation transformed the war from a conflict to preserve the Union into a crusade for human freedom. The proclamation did not actually free any slaves immediately, since it only applied to areas under Confederate control. It exempted the border states and parts of the Confederacy already under Union occupation. Critics called it a meaningless gesture, but Lincoln understood its symbolic and strategic importance. The proclamation made clear that a Union victory would mean the end of slavery. It prevented Britain and France from supporting the Confederacy, since European public opinion opposed slavery. It also allowed for the recruitment of black soldiers into the Union Army. Nearly 200,000 African Americans would serve in the Union military, fighting for their own freedom and the freedom of their people. In November 1863, Lincoln delivered one of the most famous speeches in American history at the dedication of the Soldiers' National Cemetery in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. The Battle of Gettysburg in July had been the turning point of the war, ending Lee's invasion of the North. Lincoln's Gettysburg address lasted just 2 minutes and contained only 272 words, but it redefined the meaning of the war. Lincoln invoked the Declaration of Independence and its promise that all men are created equal. He said the war was testing whether a nation conceived in liberty could long endure. He called on Americans to ensure that the soldiers had not died in vain, that the nation would have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, would not perish from the earth. The war ground on through 1864 with terrible casualties on both sides. The battles of the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, and Cold Harbor saw thousands killed in brutal fighting. General William Tecumseh Sherman besieged Atlanta while Grant pursued Lee in Virginia. The Northern public grew weary of the war and the mounting death toll. Lincoln faced re-election in November 1864, and his prospects looked grim. The Democratic Party nominated George McClellan, Lincoln's former general, on a platform calling for a negotiated peace with the Confederacy. Lincoln believed he would lose the election. He even wrote a memo predicting his defeat and asking his cabinet to cooperate with the new administration to save the Union before the inauguration. But Sherman's capture of Atlanta in September changed everything. The fall of Atlanta showed that the Union was winning and that victory was possible. Northern morale surged. In November, Lincoln won re-election decisively, carrying all but 3 states. Lincoln interpreted his victory as a mandate to finish the war and end slavery permanently. He pushed for passage of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which would abolish slavery throughout the United States. Lincoln lobbied members of Congress personally, using all his political skills to secure the necessary votes. On January 31, 1865, the House of Representatives passed the 13th Amendment. The states would ratify it later that year, ending slavery in America forever. On March 4, 1865, Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated for his second term as president. His second inaugural address was a meditation on the meaning of the war and the need for reconciliation. Lincoln said both North and South had prayed to the same God, read the same Bible, and invoked divine aid against the other. He suggested the war was divine punishment for the sin of slavery, visited upon the whole nation. He called for malice toward none and charity for all, urging Americans to bind up the nation's wounds and achieve a just and lasting peace. The speech reflected Lincoln's deep religious faith and his belief that the war had a providential purpose. By April 1865, the end was near. Sherman had marched through Georgia and the Carolinas, destroying the South's capacity to wage war. Grant had Lee's army trapped at Petersburg, Virginia. On April 2, Lee evacuated Petersburg and Richmond, the Confederate capital. Lincoln visited Richmond on April 4, walking through the streets of the fallen city. Freed slaves gathered around him, some falling to their knees. Lincoln told them to kneel only to God. On April 9, 1865, Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses South Grant at Appomattox Court House, Virginia. The war was effectively over. The Union was preserved. Slavery was abolished. Lincoln had achieved what seemed impossible for years earlier. Lincoln looked forward to the challenges of peace and reconstruction. He wanted to bring the Southern states back into the Union quickly and without vindictiveness. He opposed the radical Republicans who wanted to punish the South harshly. Lincoln believed that with malice toward none and charity for all, the nation could heal. On April 11, Lincoln gave a speech about Reconstruction from the White House balcony. In the audience was a young actor named John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizer who hated Lincoln for destroying the South and freeing the slaves. Booth vowed that it would be the last speech Lincoln would ever give. On the evening of April 14, 1865, Good Friday, Abraham Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theater in Washington. The play was a comedy called Our American Cousin. Lincoln sat in the presidential box with his wife Mary, a young Army officer named Henry Rathbone, and Rathbone's fiancée Clara Harris. Lincoln's bodyguard left his post during the performance. At approximately 10:15 p.m., John Wilkes Booth entered the presidential box and shot Lincoln in the back of the head with a Derringer pistol. Booth leaped to the stage, breaking his leg in the fall, and shouted "Sic semper tyrannis," thus always to tyrants, the motto of Virginia. He escaped into the night. Lincoln was carried across the street to the Peterson House, where he was laid diagonally across a bed too small for his tall frame. Doctors examined him and determined the wound was mortal. Cabinet members, generals, and family gathered through the night as Lincoln lay unconscious, his breathing labored. Mary Lincoln was inconsolable with grief. At 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865, Abraham Lincoln died. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, standing at the bedside, said now he belongs to the ages. Lincoln was 56 years old. He had led the nation through its greatest crisis and had lived to see the Union preserved and slavery abolished, but he would not see the peace he had worked for. The nation mourned as it had never mourned before. Lincoln's body lay in state in the Capitol Rotunda, where thousands filed past to pay their respects. A funeral train carried his body back to Springfield, Illinois, retracing the route he had taken to Washington 4 years earlier. The train stopped in cities along the way, and millions of Americans lined the tracks to say goodbye. Lincoln was buried in Oak Ridge Cemetery in Springfield on May 4, 1865. John Wilkes Booth was tracked down and killed by federal troops on April 26. His co-conspirators were captured, tried, and hanged. Abraham Lincoln's legacy is that of the president who saved the Union and freed the slaves. He transformed America from a nation half slave and half free into a nation dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Lincoln's leadership during the Civil War showed that democracy could survive its greatest test. His assassination made him a martyr and elevated him to the status of national saint. Lincoln was a complex man, prone to depression, yet possessed of an iron will and unshakable moral conviction. He was a politician who understood the art of the possible, yet never lost sight of his ultimate goals. He was a man of humble origins who rose to the highest office through intelligence, ambition, and integrity. Lincoln's words continue to inspire Americans and people around the world. The Gettysburg Address and the Second Inaugural Address are masterpieces of political rhetoric. His life story, from log cabin to White House, embodies the American dream. Lincoln proved that in America, anyone could rise to greatness through hard work and determination. He showed that leadership requires both moral clarity and practical wisdom. Lincoln understood that preserving the Union and ending slavery were inseparable goals, that the nation could not survive half slave and half free. He was willing to use all the powers of the presidency to achieve those goals, even when criticized for overstepping his authority. Lincoln's greatness lies not just in what he accomplished but in how he accomplished it. He faced opposition from all sides, yet never became bitter or vindictive. He endured personal tragedy, losing 3 of his 4 sons, yet found the strength to carry on. He was criticized and mocked, yet responded with humor and grace. Lincoln believed in the better angels of our nature, in the capacity of human beings to overcome their worst impulses and build a more perfect union. His faith in democracy, even when democracy seemed to be failing, sustained him through the darkest days of the war. Lincoln knew that the American experiment in self-government was being tested as never before, and he was determined that it would not fail. Abraham Lincoln was not perfect. He shared some of the racial prejudices of his time. He initially prioritized preserving the Union over freeing the slaves. He suspended civil liberties during the war, jailing critics without trial and shutting down newspapers. But Lincoln grew in office, evolving from a politician who opposed slavery's expansion to the great emancipator who made freedom for all Americans his defining cause. He learned from his mistakes, listened to criticism, and adjusted his policies when necessary. Lincoln understood that leadership requires the courage to change course when circumstances demand it. He was pragmatic without being cynical, principled without being rigid. The United States that emerged from the Civil War was fundamentally different from the nation that entered it. The war ended slavery, strengthened the federal government, and established the principle that the Union was indissoluble. Lincoln's vision of a new birth of freedom would take generations to fully realize, but he set the nation on that path. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, adopted in the years after Lincoln's death, enshrined in law the equality and citizenship of all Americans regardless of race. These amendments were Lincoln's legacy, the fulfillment of the promise he made in the Gettysburg Address. Abraham Lincoln remains the most admired and studied of American presidents. Historians consistently rank him as the greatest president, alongside George Washington and Franklin Roosevelt. Lincoln's life and death have inspired countless books, films, and works of art. His image appears on the penny and the $5 bill. The Lincoln Memorial in Washington stands as a temple to his memory, a place where Americans gather to reflect on the meaning of freedom and equality. Lincoln's words are carved in stone on the memorial's walls, reminding each generation of the principles for which he fought and died. Lincoln's story is ultimately a story of hope. He showed that even in the darkest times, when the nation seemed on the verge of collapse, leadership and moral courage could prevail. He proved that democracy, for all its flaws and failures, was worth preserving. Lincoln believed that the American experiment in self-government was the last best hope of Earth, and he gave his life to ensure that hope would not perish. His legacy challenges every generation of Americans to live up to the ideals of the Declaration of Independence, to strive for a more perfect union, and to ensure that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Abraham Lincoln was, in death as in life, the man who saved the Union and freed a people.